Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel where we take on issues related to narcissistic and antagonistic personalities and all the problems raised by those relationships. So this is a pretty simple video in the sense of don't use your child as a therapist. And more importantly, I think this was the experience for many of you, how do you come back from this if your own parent used you as a therapist? So this is not an uncommon conundrum. Now this video kind of takes in two very separate issues, okay? If you are a survivor of childhood narcissistic family systems or childhood narcissistic abuse, you may have had the experience of your not narcissistic or less narcissistic parent, we'll say not narcissistic or non-abusive parent, using you as a therapist, telling you all their problems even if it was inappropriate. Or you may be a person who is a parent who's co-parenting with a narcissistic person experiencing narcissistic abuse and wanting your child or children to just be a source of support and turning to them for support in ways that they really aren't ready for. Let's put it this way, either is not good, so let's break all of this down. This is such a challenging issue. I know people in narcissistic relationships are often deeply lonely, isolated, don't know where to turn, feel helpless and hopeless. In some cases, a parent doing this, talking to their children about what's going on, may believe that maybe they're helping their child and letting them know that the mess that's swirling around them isn't their fault. But in doing that, sharing the bad things that are happening to them as their parent, as the parent in the relationship, it's a lot for a kid, right? A parent just may open up to a child, tell them how sad they are, how lonely. They may also say things like how they feel they've wasted their life in this relationship. Here's the thing. Do not do this. Do not find a therapist, join a support group, find a friend, keep a journal, anything except sharing this with children. I have tremendous empathy for co-parents who are in these situations where they're having to co-parent with a narcissistic person. The isolation is tremendous, the loneliness, and just almost the need to be ungaslighted by people who are close into the situation to see it honestly and openly. I see it, I get it, I'm just saying nobody should do this. Because if this happened to you when you were a child, you know that it harmed you. For survivors of these situations, having to be the support for the parent enduring the narcissistic or antagonistic parent's meanness, listening to the stories, trying to cheer your parent up, sometimes even acting as the human shield between the parents, and at the same time still trying to be your parent's friend, therapist, and still trying to be a kid, it's an impossible line to toe, and the children will often feel very isolated and carrying a burden that most of their peers are not. Survivors of these situations will report not only having to navigate the thorny issue of having a narcissistic parent and that sense of being not enough, the tension, the sadness, the anxiety, and the loss of self-worth and identity that comes from that, but simultaneously then to have to occupy the adult role of being there for a parent, to soothe them when you yourself live in fear and anxiety, to cheer them up when you're sad. It just isn't right to do to any child. But the child in that situation may feel a sense of guilt or shame if they believe that they are not adequately supporting their parent. So the child is caught between two roles that they are not developmentally ready for or that are not appropriate. They also don't get to have the time and safety and space to just be a child, to develop their sense of self, their identity, their interests, and have space for their needs to be safely expressed and appreciated. They are told that not only are their needs not valid, but now that they have to step up and attend to adult needs, that they as children are ill-equipped to serve. This legacy of being put into a sort of a therapist role does not do people well in the long term. People who are put in this role as children may grow up deeply anxious, prone to entangled and enmeshed relationships and people who prey on them and want their help and guidance. Folks who grow up like this may exhaust themselves trying to be all things to other people, but doing little to take care of themselves. The children who are most often put into these positions are the fixers and the helpers. And this doesn't end with childhood. This role can persist through much of adulthood, especially if your parent remains married to that narcissistic parent while you go into adulthood. And you may end up in a lifetime of hearing complaints and ruminations and obsessive talk about your narcissistic parent. You may recognize that neither of your parents actually ever recognized you as a separate person with separate needs, but either recognize you simply as a source of narcissistic supply or as a source of companionship and help. You can clearly see how this is a terrible setup for any relationships going into adulthood. But what may happen is that you might see this happening to someone else, right? Maybe you're watching this happen to your niece or nephew, to a friend's child, just another child. It's not easy to watch this happening to a child. And as we know, giving people guidance on parenting or even making observations about someone else's parenting is really the equivalent of putting your head in a hungry lion's mouth. It's probably never a good idea. But if you are close to a parent you see doing this and are willing to take a little bit of the risk of their wrath, which may be worth it to potentially protect a child, say something. Say something gentle. If the child comes to you and says, "What's going on?" Again, if you're willing to take the risk, say something. You can do this again gently. You can tell your friend who is the parent, "I know you're going through a lot, but it's a lot for your kid to hear this. I'm happy to listen," that kind of thing. It won't be easy, especially if that person you're friends with or close with is really struggling in a toxic relationship. But the harm of what this does to a child is quite significant. And if you are lucky, you may interrupt a cycle that otherwise could persist until that child is an adult. A tricky bit of all of this is that some children get stuck in this cycle because they learn that relationships are transactional quite early, when they grew up in family systems that are characterized by these narcissistic patterns. So they may actually be glad that a parent wants this time with them, or may even feel special to get to have these conversations or have this function. It may help the child feel needed or wanted, something that should happen naturally, but is often thwarted in these kinds of family systems. If this did happen to you, if you were sort of put into this therapist role by a parent in a narcissistic relationship, keep in mind that it's never too late to start setting boundaries and creating space that feels more comfortable. You don't need to listen to this stuff, whether your parents are still together or long since out of the relationship. Whether you are 18 or 58 or 68, you're not the person that should have to listen to this. Now, be prepared for guilt and victimhood if you stop listening in most cases, but it's not your job to be the shrink to anyone, unless you're actually a shrink and being paid for it. But it's not your job to be a shrink to anyone close to you, least of all a parent. People in these relationships do feel helpless, and children are so negatively affected by them. It's important that we are mindful that children, and even adult children that come out of these situations and who've already suffered enough, let's not make it worse. So yeah, no. I mean, a child should never have to be a parent's therapist, but I know that many of you may have survived something like this. And for many survivors, most of whom will come out with a lot of empathy and a lot of anxiety, there can be a sense of guilt if they feel like they didn't listen. But if nothing else, to know that that was actually not an appropriate position for a child to be in. Yes, it has fallout. But above all else, if you felt like, "Oh, I wish I'd been there more," if you even listened once, you were there probably more than you needed to be. So thanks again.